Everyone. Last week, I posted a short article on the GymAware's website talking about velocity loss and try to explain what velocity loss is, how to use it in resistance training, and what's the point of like measuring by velocity and making sure we stay within a certain target. And I hope at least I made myself somewhat clear in terms of the applications of velocity loss in all things like strength training and power development. And there's one thing that becomes evident once we understand velocity loss, and that is velocity loss works as a sort of a pointer for your training. It sets you on the right direction when it comes to adaptations. There's a certain point, a certain threshold of velocity loss. We can call it 20-30% velocity loss. And if we stay below that threshold, our adaptation would be predominantly neuromuscular, or some people like to call it functional. We improve the function of the neuromuscular system as a whole. And that function comes down to force development, either the amount of force we're producing or the rate at which we are producing force, so rate of force development. And that's great when we work in all things strength and conditioning and all things performance related. That's the type of adaptation we're really looking for. If we go past that 20-30% velocity threshold, the pattern of adaptation starts to change slightly. It's no longer predominantly functional. It becomes predominantly structural, meaning, for lack of better terms, we're promoting muscle growth. We're promoting hypertrophy. That hypertrophy may or may not correspond to an increase in strength, and we need to be a little bit more careful when we let that happen. So I don't want that message to come across as hypertrophy is bad. Far from it. If hypertrophy is your goal, well, then you probably want to forget about velocity loss and bring sets close to volitional failure, because that's where you really increase time under tension, you increase volume as a function of sets and reps. Maybe you sacrifice load a little bit, but you really do promote a significant increase in muscle mass. However, hypertrophy becomes bad or not so positive as adaptation when that hypertrophy is not wanted or is not controlled for. Meaning, if we're not planning on growing muscles and we end up growing muscle because as a consequence of poorly planned training, that becomes a problem. Because every time we promote muscle growth, to some extent, of course, we promote an increase in muscle mass, an increase in body mass, an increase in body weight. That increase in body weight may or may not be matched by an increase in strength, lower body strength predominantly, and therefore power may be affected as a consequence. If our relative strength doesn't increase over time, so the amount of force that we can produce compared to our body weight, well, that can create a problem. And of course, on a smaller scale, for a shorter training intervention, that might not be a big issue. If a training program lasts 4 to 6 weeks, the amount of hypertrophy that we can produce, it's limited, so it's not going to have a massive impact on performance. But if we consistently do that over and over again, well, that may become a problem, especially for longer training periods. And that problem, it's difficult to fix unless we have an objective way of measuring the quality of our volume. What I mean for quality, we tend to associate hypertrophy or muscle growth with our traditional bodybuilding like type of training intervention. So 3 sets of 10, 3 sets of 12, sets to failure, short as periods, like 30 to 90 seconds, long time under tension, long eccentric time under tension, hypoxia, blood flow restriction, all those variables that can contribute to muscle growth. And that's all right and good. And that's how we can promote more muscle growth. However, we often tend to forget that hypertrophy it's affected by overall training volume, not just the type of training that promotes hypertrophy. That promotes even more muscle growth, but in general, muscle growth is promoted by training volume. So when we accumulate many sets and reps over 2 to 3 days a week for the same muscle groups. And that tends to be the case when we do resistant training, because we don't do single joint movements like a bodybuilding program would want us to do. We do mostly core compound lifts where we target the same muscle groups over and over again. A beginner will do that twice a week, but as we start moving up the ladder and we become stronger and more advanced athletes, well, then maybe 3 times a week, 4 times a week, 5 times a week, the same muscle groups over and over again. We keep promoting that activation of the mTOR pathway, and that eventually will lead to muscle growth. Of course, not as significant as the muscle growth you would see in a bodybuilding program, but nevertheless muscle growth. And if an athlete is particularly prone to muscle growth, prone to muscle hypertrophy, that would be even more so evident over a longer period of time. So we need to put some constraints in place to make sure that muscle growth it's wanted. Like we expect that to happen, so we can control for it, we can adapt and respond to it, and we can manipulate other training variables, and in particular long terms type of structuring of our program, where we account for adequate amount of time to increase strength level and power levels and all that good stuff, so that our performance doesn't get compromised. And those constraints in place is that we look at the quality of our repetitions. For lack of better words, we try to minimize the effects of fatigue to make sure that every repetition is performed with great intent, optimal velocity, optimal acceleration, and therefore we facilitate that functional side of the adaptation process, and we choose how much hypertrophy we like to carry on with us. In that respect, we don't need to look at velocity loss as like clear cutoff, like 10%, 20%, 30%. As long as we stay somewhere below 20%, our chances of promoting a significant increase in muscle mass are limited. If we start going past that 20% and we tip into 30%, 40%, 50% velocity loss, that's where hypertrophy takes over. So staying below 20%, it's a good idea. And there's no way for us to know precisely whether, like, let's say we're doing strength training, we should do 20%. We're doing power training, we should do 10%. That's just a guideline. We really want to stay below that 20% mark. A good rule of thumb is, when in doubt, it's not a bad idea to keep velocity loss around 10, 15%. It's just going to decrease the number of repetitions per set. It's going to decrease the buildup of fatigue. You're probably going to get some volume at the end of your workout, but nearly not as much as you would get if you were to use a more generous threshold for velocity loss. So my advice would be, if you are using velocity loss, and if you're not using velocity loss, then maybe look at repetition in reserve. We touched upon it in the article. Look at repetition reserve to make sure that your strength training exercises or those lifts that are designed to promote strength and power are indeed focusing on the functional side of things. So keep the volume to the bare minimum, the intensity as high as possible, and that intensity is coming from the load that you're using, but also the velocity at which you're moving. So heavier loads, greater velocity, greater intensity overall, and then choose wisely where and how to promote that muscle growth as needed when needed. And that can be done adding specific exercise to target specific muscle groups, traditional bodybuilding exercises, eccentric training, isometric training, and all those fancy fun ways of promoting muscle growth. But my advice is to keep things separated, which tends not to be the case when we don't use velocity loss, because not knowing how many repetitions per set and what's the optimal volume, we tend to overdo, and that's a fact. Like, if you start measuring velocity-based training, if you start measuring velocity loss and you do velocity-based training, you realize how different the volume looks like compared to what you've done otherwise. Like the traditional percentage-based training tends to inflate volume a little bit too much, and that inflation in volume ends up covering a little bit of that structural adaptation that we want to really control for. Put some constraints in place, use velocity loss, and then be deliberate in the way you add exercises for muscle hypertrophy. I really hope the article I wrote helps. I look forward to receiving more feedback. I know some of you already read it and appreciate it, and that makes me very happy. But if you have any question, please feel free to reach out. Anything, it doesn't have to be velocity-based training related. Anything about strength training, program design, periodization, I can talk for days. So I'm happy to connect, and thank you for reading.